Night Shift. Scott McDowell and Logan Bailey were security guards for a local grocery store. Scott worked the night, and Logan took over the day. Scott had just started, but it didn't take long before he realized that the store wasn't making much business. Day after day, they got less sales and more shoplifters. After a while, Scott didn't feel too secure about the area, but luckily he was permitted to take a taser with him. And since he was never inside the store, and it was during the night hours, Scott was also allowed to take his dog. Over time, he became friends with the night crew, which was normally Billy the stock clerk and Edna the cashier. The only person he really didn't get along with was the night manager. He was strict and mean, and he always felt like he had to holler and yell to make his point heard. Scott was just happy he didn't have to deal with him. But Billy was always complaining to Scott about how much he hated him. One night, Billy was talking to Scott and Edna outside during the closing hours. "I'm glad this place is closing soon," Billy said. "Well, I'm not happy about it. That means I'll have to find a new job, and in this area, that's not easy to come by," Scott responded. "I really don't understand it. This area has it all. A mall, restaurants, supermarkets. Where is everyone?" Billy remained silent, so Edna finally took a sip of her beer and spoke. "This place used to be a graveyard. Hadn't anybody told you?" Billy shook his head, a little aggravated. "Do you know how to keep a secret? You could get me in trouble," Billy yelled. But Edna was insistent and maybe a little intoxicated. She walked over and nudged Billy on the side. Come on, Billy. God knows how to keep a secret, too. Don't you, Scott?" Scott was a little surprised. He tucked his hands away in his coat pocket, a little confused. He had never heard of this allegation before. He began to think the whole story was ridiculous, and just for fun, he nodded in agreement. So Billy would tell the story. He shrugged before speaking. "All right, fine, but let's keep it on the quiet side. And if you do tell anyone, you don't bring my name in on any of this." Again they nodded, so he would continue his story. "Yeah, this place used to be a cemetery. It was huge. Where all these buildings are now used to be graves. Little by little, people began to get laid off because not enough people died here and the morgue couldn't make a profit. And they got rid of the undertaker. After they got rid of the undertaker, they had no other choice but to shut the place down. A buyer came along and said he would take the morgue off the owner's hands. They got out the contracts, and before long, they came to an agreement. It took too much time and manpower to move the body, so instead the buyer hired someone to take out all the tombstones and move them just a few towns over to the other morgue. Then he cemented and created paved roads and buildings right over the dead bodies. As appalled as people were, they still had to eat, and this shopping complex was the closest market for the next 30 miles. Still made good business, and the buyer knew that. It would. Things took a turn for the worse when people started to mysteriously disappear inside the grocery store. Then the restaurants nearby, and even in the malls, people cried out saying there were children missing. Sadly enough, they were not found. Lost. Forever. Edna jumped up and pushed Billy, almost knocking him down. "Tell him the really scary part." "I'm getting there," Billy yelled. "We're going to get in so much trouble if the manager catches us out here." He looked around before continuing the story. So anyways, people started to make some conclusions that the living dead rose up at night and claimed they were the ones taking the people. They said they would come out through the side of the walls or in the floors and ceiling. And some believed they made coffins because they wanted us to join them. There was always talk about coffins being made, but only small coffins. Only ones the size for a child to fit. They were never found. Now seeing the manager looking around through the window, Edna quickly walked inside the store while Billy was talking. Now, supposedly people there heard the voices claim there were 3 things the zombies really hated, Billy continued. The first thing they hated was the light. That's why a lot of these strange missing disappearances usually happened at night. They have been hidden away in the darkness for so long they can't stand the light. And the second thing they hate is the living. They envy us because we don't decompose. We're not falling apart like they are. The third and the most important thing to do is, if you never want to attract any attention, is to stay quiet. They hate noise with a passion. They're used to so many years of peace and quiet. Some say the loud noises of business and traffic is what reawakened them in the first place. Even the slightest noise would make them draw attention towards you. As Billy said this, a screeching sound was heard nearby. The dog suddenly began to bark, tugging on the chain he was tied to. Scott turned around suddenly in a panic. Then he turned back around, a little bit annoyed that he was frightened so easily. It turned out that Billy was scrolling his pocket knife over the pavement, making the dog think there was someone nearby. Just then, Billy noticed his manager standing outside with his arms crossed.
"What are you doing out here, you wuck? You got work to do. We're gonna talk about this in the morning, but for now, I need the store cleaned up so I can go home. Now, hurry up. I'm gonna report you tomorrow."
He motioned Billy to come over, but it didn't really bother him. He never took his job serious anyways. As he walked back inside, he turned back around, laughing. Sorry about that. I had no idea you'd freak out so easily. Scott got back in his security car and felt a little uneasy. As he shook off the nervous feeling, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Can't be true. Probably some prank these two tried to pull to scare me, he thought. But what if that was true? He wouldn't want to work at a place that had a morgue underground. He turned on the ignition, wondering if he should leave. I should at least finish out my shift. I'll go look for a place in the morning, he said to himself. Instead, Scott decided he would just turn on the radio and listen to some tunes. The shift seemed so long, and as the time went by, Scott began to settle in, knowing Billy and Edna were just trying to get the better of him. It's been over 2 days since Scott had slept, and now it was really starting to affect him. He didn't even realize he fell asleep until he woke up around 2:30 in the morning. He was surprised the manager never tried to wake him up in all that time. But something was strange. The lights in the store were still on. As he partially opened the car door, his dog ran out. Scott called to him and the dog got stuck, his leash tied to the clutch of the car. The dog yelped and barked and tugged more, even clawing the street until he was loose. Scott immediately went after his dog. He lost the dog in the darkness and instead walked back up to the store. He'll come back, he thought. He always does. Scott looked through the glass windows of the store, trying to see if anyone was inside. The double doors at the end of the store that leads to the storage area were moving. He tried to pry open the door, but it was locked. And breaking in was out of the question. Just 3 months ago, they installed bulletproof glass over the entire complex. He didn't have his cell. He left it charging at home. However, he remembered there was a payphone at the other side of the store, and they don't charge for emergency calls. Scott immediately called and waited for the operator to call the authorities. They said they would be sending a patrol car over, but it would take some time. As Scott stayed by the payphone, his dog came back. He looked closer and saw blood dripping from the side of his dog's mouth. The dog dropped something. They looked like keys, and they were blood-stained. Scott left the person on the phone and ran over to his car. Before he left, he mumbled to himself, No, what if Billy and Edna are still in there? They could be hurt, or worse, by the time the police got there. Scott took a deep breath and got out of his car, taking the taser from the holster on his belt. He looked for the keys. He noticed the keys had a big ring around them, and it looked like the one the managers always carry around. Slowly, he unlocked the front door of the store and slid it open, then quickly shut it behind him. He took a few steps inside and was immediately tackled to the ground. It was Billy, and he was struggling to get back to his feet. Before he could leave, the shutters on the windows and both exits to the doors closed. Billy yelled as he rammed into them. It was solid steel. Panicking, he attempted to now lift it up, but they were bolted to the ground.
It's too late. It's too late.
Billy yelled. He laughed in a nervous tone. His eyes were bloodshot. He simply could not believe he was almost out when Scott had stopped him.
Now it's too late for all of us.
His voice got higher.
It's your fault. We're all gonna die, Scott. They get pleasure out of killing people. They kill everyone in different ways. You know why there's only children coffins, Scott? You want to know?
Because they want to make room, so they cut the bodies in half and stuff them inside.
You're losing it, Billy.
Scott shouted back. None of us are going to die. My dog's here, and besides, I have my taser. And if you just wait a few minutes, the police will be here, and they will find a way to open the doors.
We won't last that long. You haven't seen what I saw. It's all over.
Billy, stop it, Scott demanded, even if what you say is true. You've said zombies hated loud noises. Stop yelling, and we will survive. Just then, a clunk of the floor turned sideways, and Billy fell through. Then, the tile floor closed back, sealing itself back up. Gone. Just like that, Billy's voice could still be heard through the floorboard, and Scott attempted to stomp down, trying to open it back up. Billy just screamed as if he was being torn apart. Finally, the floor turned back, but as it did, Scott could see Billy's hands were nailed to it. His body was already decomposing. This is impossible, but it had to be Billy. It was his uniform, his name tag. To make things worse, spiders began to claw out of Billy's eye sockets. His neck was torn open and scorpions began to make their way through the opening. Inside of his mouth was a venomous rattlesnake. It nearly bit Scott as it snapped, only missing by an inch or so. The spiders leaped onto the dog and began biting it. The dog ran through the double doors into the storage room. Now Scott was alone. He tried to follow his dog, but he thought the best way to lose the snake was to zigzag through the aisles, and it worked, too. Finally, he ran through the deli in the back. But he stopped, and his eyes widened from the sight. There were all the children's coffins that Billy had been talking about earlier. Now, he attempted to open one of the coffins, but it was nailed shut. He got a crowbar nearby and forced some of the coffins open. Now it was clear where the night manager and Edna had been. Inside the coffin, he found Edna's body and the manager in the next one over. Their bodies had been cut in half. The legs were turned facing inward so they could fit. Scott wanted to leave as soon as possible. Turned to leave the deli stockroom, but there was now a dark figure in his path. Its flesh was rotted and barely hanging onto the bone. It walked stiffly, dragging its other leg behind as if it was broken. It was limping over to Scott, and it seemed upset. You disturbed our peace. You pollute our place with your light, and you have the nerve to show yourself. You will suffer slowly, very slowly. Scott swung the crowbar, and the corpse took a direct hit. Its skull cracked as it made its way to the ground. Scott rushed out, adrenaline racing, and now attempted to get out the only way there might be now. He had been in the store before and knew it had an attic. There was a chance that the windows in the attic were not boarded up, but before that he would have to go to the storage area. Now it was chained from the other side, and those chains were tied with a lock. But Scott could see through the window. They had his dog, and he was enraged. The dog was held up sideways in the air by 2 ropes. At the bottom was an electric saw blade. Slowly, they lowered the dog down, and the dog howled. The saw sparked, and its motor sound was no match for the dog's howling cries. Now the blade began to cut into the dog, and the howling continued. It went down another quarter of an inch as his guts began to be torn open, and the howling continued. Blood was flooding the ground, seeping underneath the door that Scott was watching, and the howling continued. Scott banging on the door, trying to break it open. Infuriated, he had raised this dog from a pup. They paid no attention. They were irritated by the loud noise of the dog, and they opened the dog's mouth wide open, dislocating the jawbone, and the howling continued. They now got a pair of pliers, and when one of them held the dog's jaw open, the other began to tear the dog's tongue out. But still the howling continued. Even through its muffled voice, the howling did not stop. The saw blade cut through halfway in the dog. By now, the dog wasn't going to last much longer, but Scott was still determined to break in. He yelled and hollered and rammed into the door as much as he could. Finally, the door began to give way and completely opened. By then, the damage was done, and the dog was cut in half as the saw blade continued to cut through the bone. Still, the dog managed to claw up to Scott before dying. Scott, now more enraged than scared, started to use his taser on them. He tried to make his way to the stairs, to the attic, but the hideous creatures grabbed a hold of him. There were far too many. They held him and dragged him back to the deli room and got a coffin laid out for him. Now they opened the coffin. But before they could cut him open, they heard police sirens. When the police got there, they found no one. But they entered the deli and heard one of the coffins shaking on the ground. It was sealed, so they opened it. It was Scott. He was gasping for air and yelling at the top of his lungs for help. He was in so much pain. The zombies didn't have time to cut him open, so they just pulled his legs back in the coffin until they snapped. Both of his legs were broken. 2 weeks have passed since the incident. It was storming outside the hospital that Scott was confined to. He felt safer there than in the store, at least. However, the hospital wasn't doing so well because it was in a small area and the newer generation of people were moving away to the city. But they told Billy they would be transferring him to the closest hospital. Suddenly, Scott got a call on his cell phone. When he picked it up, it was Logan. "Hey, Scott, it's me," Logan said. "I hope you're getting well soon. I just got a new security position at the hospital." "That's great," Scott responded. "I'm not staying here long, though. I'm moving out." Logan laughed before he spoke again. "You don't know the half of it." Scott paused for a moment before he spoke back, listening closely. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Well, for the past week, the complex we used to work at was torn down. It's now a hospital. And now it's the one you're transferring to. That's the new one I'm going to be working at." When the nurses opened the door to check up on Scott, he was nowhere in sight. He must have been in a rush because they only left him for a few moments and neither of his legs worked. He must have been desperate because he managed to open the window by the bed and drag himself out.